In June 1914, Europe was a tinderbox waiting for a spark that could ignite the world in war. In June 1914, in a remote corner of Europe, a young assassin lay in wait for the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and for his wife, Sophie. The bomb missed its target. Disaster was averted. Back in May 1910, at the funeral of King Edward VII of England, Europe was at peace, but only just. Uniformed emperors, kings, and heads of state from 70 nations came to pay their respects in a dramatic military display of power. It was the largest gathering of royalty the world had ever seen. Behind the facade of friendship, each great power vied to safeguard its different interests. Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia were united in their need to protect their vast empires. In between them lay the powerful, landlocked strongholds of Germany and Austria-Hungary. They dreamt of European domination. Warships were rearmed. Armies that had been 200,000 strong a few decades earlier now had grown to millions. By 1914, Europe was in the grip of its first arms race. The aging emperor, Franz Joseph, had ruled his empire of Austria-Hungary at the center of Europe for the last 66 years. He was 84 years old, and most of his subjects had never lived without him. From his seat of power in the court of Vienna, he rose every morning from his iron army bed at 4 a.m. He held his decaying empire together by the sheer force of his authority. After his son committed suicide, he named his nephew Franz Ferdinand as heir to the empire. Ferdinand hated Vienna and preferred to live in the fairy tale castle of Konopiste, in countryside near Prague. Here, away from the stifling etiquette of Vienna, he invited many important guests to enjoy the castle and its grounds. In early June 1914, Ferdinand, dressed in his customary plumed finery, received one of Europe's most powerful men, the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm believed firmly in the alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary. He now looked to the heir, Ferdinand, to secure the friendship between these two powers. At Konopiste Castle, Ferdinand and Wilhelm discussed politics. The country of Serbia, lying to the south of Austria-Hungary, was a thorn in the empire's side. Serbia was determined to create a rival Slavic empire of her own. In 1908, Austria-Hungary had annexed the neighboring province, the Serb-dominated Bosnia-Herzegovina. There were violent repercussions. Serbia's ambitions had been thwarted. She became a dangerous enemy. Behind locked doors in Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, outposts of Europe, a secret underground organization emerged called the Black Hand. Recruiting from idealistic schoolboys and impoverished peasants, the Black Hand demanded the ultimate sacrifice from its young members, victory or death. The aim of the organization, to free their oppressed Serb brothers from Austro-Hungarian domination and further Serb unification by violent terrorist activity. As future emperor of all Austria-Hungary, Ferdinand was one of the Black Hand's main targets. Ferdinand was both a hunter and collector, and he proudly displayed his vast array of medieval armory to his honored guests. In June 1914, Ferdinand planned to inspect in person the main imperial military maneuvers which were to be held in the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Sarajevo. He would go to the troublesome province in his position as Inspector General of the Armed Forces. Serbia would clearly see the danger of antagonizing Austria-Hungary. When the Black Hand heard of Ferdinand's proposed visit to Sarajevo, preparations began to assassinate the Archduke. Among the potential assassins were two friends, Nedeljko Kabrinović and Gavrilo Princip. Like many of the recruits, they were young, poverty-stricken and consumptive. They saw their chance to rid Serbia of her greatest enemy. Franz Joseph had himself visited the province 4 years earlier, amid fierce security. He advised his nephew that assassination attempts were a threat, but he did not dissuade his nephew from going. All he said was, "Do as you will." There was no love lost between them, and a woman was the cause. When Franz Joseph found out that Ferdinand had secretly proposed to Sophie Chotek, a mere lady-in-waiting of lower aristocracy, he demanded that he choose between his heart or his duty. Ferdinand was adamant he would have both. After months of tortured negotiations, Franz Joseph agreed to the marriage, only if Ferdinand renounced all future titles for Sophie and their children. Neither man would ever forgive or forget. Ferdinand lived for Sophie and their three children, little Sophie, Maximilian, and Ernst. He said, "Marrying Sophie was the most intelligent thing I have ever done." When Sophie heard of the Sarajevo trip to inspect the maneuvers, she was adamant she would accompany her husband. They would leave the children behind at Konopiste. The young assassins from the Black Hand had heard that Ferdinand and his wife were going to drive through the streets of Sarajevo in an open-top car. They mapped out key positions for each man. Princip would stand outside Schiller's store, Kabrinović by one of the bridges on Apple Quay, and between them, they would have the route covered. In the days before their departure, Ferdinand and Sophie relaxed in the company of the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. By the end of his visit, Ferdinand was sure of the Kaiser's support against Serbia. Meanwhile, the assassins were all but ready for the royal visit. As Ferdinand and Sophie prepared to leave for Sarajevo, Sophie became afraid. Serb hatred of Austria-Hungary, the heir to the throne Ferdinand and all he stood for, was well known to her. She feared for his life. But if there was danger ahead, she would not leave her husband's side. A month earlier, 3 boys, Princip, Kabrinović and another, had stolen across country from Serbia to Sarajevo. Armed with pistols, bombs and cyanide supplied from Belgrade, they had evaded informers and police and made their way by stealth across country. In Sarajevo, the multi-religious capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, preparations were underway for the great event of the year. Crowds poured into the cosmopolitan center from neighboring Croatia and Serbia to catch a glimpse of the royal couple. The streets were hung with decorations. In a serious lapse of security, the exact route of the royals' movements was advertised on billboards around the city. Security was the responsibility of the Bosnian governor, General Potirek. While thousands of loyal forces were at hand for the maneuvers, they were forbidden from the city, and protection lay in the hands of a small police force. The governor was certain there'd be no threat from the crowds. On the 25th of June 1914, Ferdinand and Sophie arrived at the Hotel Bosnia in the outskirts of Sarajevo. Sophie looked forward to 2 days of official visits to the orphanages and schools and churches of Sarajevo. Meanwhile, Ferdinand inspected the Imperial Army maneuvers in the mountainous region southwest of the capital. 22,000 troops took part. The Bosnian 15th Army Corps drawn up against Croatia's 16th Corps. The Governor-General, Potirek, was in overall command. After 2 days, Ferdinand was delighted with all that he saw. He sent the Emperor Franz Joseph a telegram on the 27th. The state of the troops, their training and their performance were excellent beyond praise. Tomorrow I shall visit Sarajevo and leave in the evening. Ferdinand was confident of a warm reception. On the morning of the 28th, Ferdinand and Sophie set off from their hotel. The 28th was not an auspicious day for the Serbs of Sarajevo. 525 years before, the Turks had conquered the Slavs. Now, on the anniversary of that defeat, new rulers had come to boast their powers. The planned route for the royal motorcade procession was to drive up the Apple Quay alongside the river Miljacka as far as the city hall, where the mayor would officially welcome the Archduke and his wife on behalf of the city. 6 assassins took up their positions on either side of the road, hoping for a chance to strike. Kabrinovic stopped by a photographer's shop and had his picture taken, with a bomb in his right-hand pocket and a Serb nationalist broadsheet in the other. He said, "So that a memory would remain behind me." At 10:15 a.m. by the Komerja Bridge, Kabrinovic put his courage to the test. Two officers and Sophie's lady-in-waiting were injured. Ferdinand and Sophie were shaken but unharmed. They were driven quickly away from the chaos in the street to the city hall. Kabrinovic threw himself into the river in a futile attempt to escape. Once he was confronted by his assailants, he swallowed the cyanide. The royal couple arrived at the city hall. The mayor prepared to receive them. Our hearts are full of happiness on the occasion of the most gracious visit with which your highnesses have deigned to honor the capital. Ferdinand broke in. "Mayor, what good are your speeches? I come to Sarajevo on a friendly visit and someone throws a bomb at me. It is outrageous. Gabrinovich's cyanide failed. He was dragged away, half-conscious. An aide advised the Archduke to wait until troops could be brought in to clear the streets. The governor, Poitorek, would not hear of it. The troops were not in dress uniform. It would be an offense to the Archduke. The crowds offered no threat. Ferdinand insisted that he went back through the city to visit the injured in hospital. It was decided that the announced route would be changed to avoid the narrow streets of the inner city. They would drive straight down the Apple Quay. Ferdinand had one request. He wanted his wife to be taken directly back to the Hotel Bosnia. Sophie refused. As long as my husband appears in public today, I shall not leave him. At 10:45 a.m., the lead car turned off the Apple Quay into Joseph Street, just in front of Schiller's store. No one had told the driver of the change of plan. Ferdinand and Sophie's car made to follow when General Poitorek yelled at the driver to continue along the quay. Gavrilo Princip saw his chance. The shots hit home. Ferdinand's dying words were for his wife. Sophie, live for our children. Princip was dragged away by police. The Archduke was shot in the neck. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne died 10 minutes after the woman he loved. The marriage that had begun with intrigue and imperial scorn ended in tragedy. When he was told of Franz Ferdinand's death, the Emperor Franz Joseph showed little reaction to his nephew's murder. The royal bodies were carried back to Vienna. There was no state funeral. He ordered no investigation into the lack of protection for his heir. He even praised Governor General Poitorek in the highest possible terms within days of the assassination. He saw the tragedy as a perfect pretext to absorb Serbia, as he had absorbed Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908. While the fate of Europe hung in the balance, Franz Joseph sent an ultimatum to Serbia, which he knew they would not accept. He made no pretense to negotiate. Within 48 hours, on July the 28th, the Emperor Franz Joseph declared war on Serbia. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, immediately reacted against the aggression. As champion of the Slavic Serbs, he would not allow Austro-Hungarian intimidation on Serbia. On that very day, Russia began mobilizing her troops against Austria-Hungary. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm, unwilling to restrain Austria-Hungary, demanded that Russia demobilize. When the Tsar refused, he rode out with his troops and declared war on Russia. Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary now at loggerheads, war pressed in from all sides. Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally, on the 3rd of August. The next day, Germany marched through Belgium, which was neutral to France. Britain, sworn to protect Belgium, was pulled into the conflict. By midnight, August the 4th, there was no avoiding full-scale war. Ferdinand and Sophie's deaths in a remote city in Central Europe sparked an uncontrollable sequence of events. They were the first of more than 12 million to die in the world's first Great War. In Serbia, in the months and years that followed the assassination, thousands would die. They would not live to see their country joined with Bosnia and Croatia into a new state, Yugoslavia. In October 1914, 6 of the assassins from the Black Hand were tried and convicted in Sarajevo. In spite of the terrible consequences for themselves and for war-torn Europe, not one of them expressed regret. For them, the sacrifice was noble. Only the lucky few survived. Most died in prison or at the gallows. Gavrilo Princip died in his cell in 1918. 2 years later, his remains were transferred back to Sarajevo, where he became something of a national hero. Outside Schiller's store, where he had fired the deadly shot, a gold inscription read, "On this historic spot, Gavrilo Princip initiated freedom on St. Vitus Day, June the 28th, 1914. (1917), the year of revolutions in Russia. In February, the all-powerful Tsar was overthrown as the First World War took a disastrous toll of Russian lives. A socialist, Alexander Kerensky, became prime minister, but chose not to end the war. After months of civil unrest, his arch-rival, Vladimir Lenin, overthrew him in what became known as the October Revolution. Russia in 1917 was a vast country, bigger than China, India, and the United States put together. 2 men would vie for control of this colossus. Both had grown up in the same hometown of Simbirsk on the Volga River, and they shared similar backgrounds. Alexander Kerensky's father was a schoolteacher in the town. Lenin's father was the inspector of schools for the Simbirsk region. Lenin was born Vladimir Ulyanov. The Ulyanovs were a prosperous middle-class family. The father, Ilya, was a champion of education and had set up several hundred schools in his region. But his popular liberal curriculum soon ran into trouble with Russia's Orthodox Church. The Russian people were deeply religious. The church was immensely powerful and fiercely opposed any challenges to the status quo. Russia had only recently rid itself of serfdom, but it was still a country dominated by agriculture. 80% of the population lived in extreme poverty, forever in debt to the landowners. Industries were expanding rapidly and drew huge numbers of people from the land. But with low wages and long hours, life in the factory was no better. The Tsar ruled his empire just as medieval kings had once ruled Europe, issuing orders from isolation without ever seeing their consequences. Lenin's older brother, Alexander, was a student at St. Petersburg University. In the final year of his studies, he was arrested carrying a bomb hidden in a chemistry textbook. Alexander was hanged for attempting to assassinate the Tsar. His brother's criminal record meant that Lenin's family was ostracized. Alexander's execution was to have a lasting effect on the young Lenin. One person who stood by the family was Alexander Kerensky's father, Fyodor. Courageously, he wrote to recommend Lenin to university to study law. As the brother of a revolutionary martyr, Lenin was immediately drawn into student politics. Soon he was expelled from the university and ordered to confine himself to his grandfather's dacha. It was here that Lenin first read Karl Marx.
His principal motive was hatred. Marx's doctrine of class war, relentless and aiming at the final destruction of the enemy, was congenial to his emotional attitude. He hated not only the Tsar and the lawless and arbitrary rule of the police, but their opposites, the liberals and the bourgeoisie.
He spent 4 years in exile. Finally, the authorities relented and allowed him to sit for the bar. He then moved to St. Petersburg, ostensibly to practice law. But in fact, he was making contact with other revolutionaries. In 1897, arrested for inciting strikes, Lenin was exiled to Siberia. Meanwhile, a new Tsar had come to power, but Nicholas II was no reformer. Emperor of all the Russias, Grand Duke of Lithuania and Finland, Tsar of Poland and Siberia, and much else. Lenin was able to devote much of his time to corresponding with the communist intelligentsia of Europe. He became a prolific writer. It was while in exile that he formulated his concept of the professional revolutionary, people whose career was dedicated to the overthrow of capitalist governments throughout Europe.
The Russian worker will lead the proletariat by direct road of open political struggle to the triumphant communist revolution.
Lenin wasn't writing only about factory workers. To him, agriculture too operated under the same capitalist conditions. The landless poor were being exploited by the rich peasants and landowners. All were their class enemies. When the Tsarist authorities woke up to the threat that Lenin still posed, he was forced to leave Russia and was to spend almost half his adult life abroad in Switzerland, Paris, Brussels, and London. He was the guiding force behind what became known as Bolshevism. The Bolsheviks were full-time revolutionaries dedicated to the forcible overthrow of the Tsar. Their newspaper, called Iskra, the Spark, became the underground gospel of Russian socialism.
Revolution is a tough business. You can't make it wearing white gloves and with clean hands. Give us an organization of revolutionaries and we will overthrow Russia.
For these ruthless agents of the law, justice was strictly a business proposition.
Follow the money. Money's the bottom line.
For the man with a price on his head, that made them
hands up,
his worst nightmare.
Under arrest.
Bounty Hunters on Wild West Tech. Tonight at 8 on the History Channel.
Tsar Nicholas II, isolated in his own world, was completely ignorant of what was going on in his own country. The ostentatious wealth of his royal court was in stark contrast with the lives of most Russian people. Surrounded by a conservative Orthodox church and married to an unpopular and interfering woman who could hardly speak Russian, Nicholas was a weak leader. He packed his court with relatives, whose first concern was to protect their privileged lifestyles. Nicholas's naive belief in Russia's imperial destiny led him to try to annex Manchuria and so secure eastern ports and markets. Japanese interests were threatened, and in 1904, war broke out. The Russian forces, far from home and badly equipped, were devastated. It was then that the first cracks in Tsarist rule appeared. Reform was inevitable. Nicholas was forced to create a form of advisory parliament with nationwide representatives. It was called the Duma. One of the Duma's few independent voices was Alexander Kerensky. Like Lenin, Kerensky had gone on to study law, and like Lenin, had become a passionate socialist. Despite being an elected member of the Tsar's parliament and a committed Democrat, Kerensky continued to travel across the country, meeting revolutionaries and planning the Tsar's overthrow.
Я считаю, наша главная задача. Мы должны избавиться от коррумпированного царского режима. Вот эти трусы и клоуны, они должны быть выметены из нашей страны.
He soon came to see himself as Russia's savior.
Россию к свободе.
Kerensky and Lenin had very different philosophies. Kerensky wanted the poor to become rich by working hard in the new Russia. Lenin wanted the rich to become poor by the redistribution of their wealth. Neither Lenin nor Kerensky had much influence on Russian politics until World War I changed the face of Europe. In the 4 years of war, an incredible 15 million Russians were sent into battle. Russia's Imperial Army was by far the largest in the world. They went with high hopes and enjoyed success at first by their sheer weight of numbers. But badly armed, underfed, and relying more on prayer than on leadership, they were helpless in the face of German machine guns and artillery. Their losses were incalculable. 5 million or 8 million, no one knew how many died. No one will ever know. A Russian officer summed it up. This is not war, sir, it is slaughter. The Germans use up metal, we use up human life. In the summer of 1916, Tsar Nicholas insisted, against all advice, on taking direct charge of the armed forces. From that point on, he would be personally identified with every military failure. Deserters in their thousands crowded into the Russian cities and swelled the ranks of the anti-war Bolsheviks. In the bitter winter of 1917, food had almost run out, and there was no fuel. While Lenin was following all this from abroad, Alexander Kerensky saw these events as his chance for glory. In a heated debate, he used all his theatrical powers to call for someone to do to the Tsar what Brutus had done to Caesar.
In order to avert the approaching catastrophe, we have to destroy the Tsar himself. Look at Russia. We can create a new light that will illuminate our way.
In February 1917, there came a sudden thaw. The skies cleared, and people took to the streets. Demonstrations became riots. The Tsar's elite guard, the Cossacks, refused to shoot the crowds. On March the 2nd, Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate. 300 years of Tsarism had come to an end. The last absolute monarch in Europe was gone. The provisional government, which was formed after the Tsar abdicated, was an odd mixture of aristocrats and intellectuals. It became a talking shop with few practical policies. Its leaders promised elections with little idea how or when these could be achieved. In this group, there was only one socialist, Alexander Kerensky. He was also on the local Soviet, a workers' committee which was carefully monitoring the new revolutionary government. Kerensky was putting himself in an impossible position. Meanwhile, Lenin was impatient to find a way back into Russia. He turned for help to Russia's enemy, Germany. Lenin arrived in St. Petersburg on the night of April the 3rd and told cheering crowds what they wanted to hear.
The people need peace. The people need bread and land. And they give you war and hunger, and the land remains with the landowners.
Lenin called for power to be transferred from the provisional government to the Soviets, whose ranks he had packed with Bolsheviks. In the days that followed, crowds heard his repeated call for peace to the soldiers, land to the peasants, and freedom for the workers. To the disillusioned soldiers and starving workers, his words struck home. 3 times between April and July, Bolsheviks would attempt, under the cover of anti-war demonstrations, to take St. Petersburg by force. But each time, at the last moment, Lenin lost his nerve. Kerensky, now the provisional government's war minister, was convinced that Russia could and should win the war. He toured the front lines, making emotional appeals to rally the troops. According to one witness,
crowds gathered for hours to catch a glimpse of him. His path was everywhere, strewn with flowers. Soldiers ran for miles after his motor car, trying to shake his hand.
But the human losses Russia had suffered were more than the country could sustain. Despite all Kerensky's personal magnetism, the June offensive against Austria collapsed. The troops deserted in droves. Kerensky, once the adored leader, became the new focus for the revolutionaries' anger. Well disciplined by Lenin, the Bolsheviks cleverly offered Russia's weary troops an end-to-war policy. A warrant was issued for Lenin's arrest on the charge that he was a German agent. Lenin went into hiding. Disguised as a railway worker, he evaded Kerensky's police and fled St. Petersburg. Alexander Kerensky, despite his military failures, became Russia's prime minister and moved into the Tsar's suite in the Baroque grandeur of the Winter Palace. Since the days when Catherine the Great had first lived here in 1762, the Winter Palace had never been occupied by a commoner, let alone a socialist. Throughout August and September, the provisional government lurched from crisis to crisis. Kerensky, always more fearful of a Tsarist counter-coup than a left-wing revolution, chose to imprison the Tsar and release the Bolshevik leaders. Lenin continued to mastermind the Bolshevik propaganda machine from his exile in Finland. Every day, Russia's tired, hungry people would read his simple message.
The rich have lots of everything. The poor have nothing. Everything will belong to the poor.
In October, Lenin secretly returned to St. Petersburg for a meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee. He urged them to seize power and told them that there would never be a better time to take over the country because the army had deserted the government. His chief organizer, Leon Trotsky, set about preparing for armed insurrection. Trotsky assembled 40,000 Red Guards from army deserters and industrial workers. Early on the morning of the 24th of October, Kerensky ordered government troops to shut down the Bolshevik newspapers. With the oxygen of publicity denied them, Kerensky believed he had delivered the Bolsheviks a fatal blow. But within hours, Bolshevik troops retook the presses. Lenin decided that it was time to strike.
Everything hangs by a hair. We must this very evening arrest the ministers. To delay the uprising is death.
That night, 5,000 Bolshevik troops were mobilized. By dawn, they had taken over most of the strategic buildings in St. Petersburg, all without any real opposition. Lenin now drafted a declaration.
To the citizens of Russia, the provisional government has been deposed. Authority has passed into the hands of the organ of the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldier Deputies. Long live the revolution of workers, soldiers, and peasants.
The Winter Palace was now the only building left in government hands. Kerensky had left the palace earlier in a belated attempt to raise more troops. He would never return. He fled the country in a car loaned by the American embassy and was to spend much of the rest of his life in the United States. At 9 p.m., the naval cruiser Aurora fired a warning shot from across the river. 2 hours later, Bolsheviks began shelling the Winter Palace. Disillusioned, the government troops melted away, and the Bolsheviks were able to enter the Winter Palace. It was so huge that for hours they didn't know whether they were yet in control. Finally, the Bolsheviks reached the Malachite Room, where a handful of cadets and a battalion of women soldiers were all that remained to defend the government. At 2 a.m., the provisional government was found in a small dining room and arrested. With scarcely a shot fired, Lenin had taken control of Russia. In November, Lenin went ahead with the election which the Kerensky government had promised. The Bolsheviks gained only 25% of the vote. Lenin ignored the result, claiming that the election was irrelevant. The coup was complete. Lenin created a one-party dictatorship and directed the Soviet Union on its future course. Although he ended his days an invalid, Lenin had by then created the society of his dreams, a dictatorship of the proletariat. In 1934, 100,000 men fled for their lives, a struggle for survival that would change the face of modern China. Revolution, their leader said, is not a tea party. It is June 1936. Edgar Snow, an idealistic young journalist from Kansas City, makes his way through northern China. He's on the trail of the scoop of his life, an interview with the leader of the Communists' Red Army. In the 8 years that Snow had been in China, he had witnessed turmoil. The vast lands were in the hands of feuding warlords. Populations fled and starved. The prosperous East Coast was threatened by Emperor Hirohito and a powerful Japan. They invaded Manchuria and bombarded Shanghai. The country was ripe for both communism and right-wing nationalism. Snow had seen their uneasy alliance against their common enemies, and then the split that set them at each other's throats, leading to civil war. Now Snow had the chance to meet the man who believed he could rule the whole of China. The man who had never before been interviewed by the West. A man whom men would follow to the end of the earth.
Edgar Snow，
进来。毛主席，谢先生。
很高兴见到你。
你好，你好。
Mao Zedong was born in 1893 into an ambitious peasant family in the village of Shaoshan in southeast China. Mao was sent to school so that he could manage the family accounts. His father, a moneylender, lent what little money he had at high interest rates to his neighbors. He beat Mao regularly. Mao grew to hate him as much as he loved his mother, but he learned that if he was compliant, he would be beaten, but that if he showed resistance, he earned respect. Finally, he ran away to college. He rose through the ranks of the communist left of the Nationalist Party. His mentor was the communist Sun Yat-sen. Another man influenced by Sun Yat-sen was Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. 6 years senior to Mao, he was his constant enemy. Chiang was an ambitious soldier, determined to destroy the communist left to establish his own leadership. In 1927, he called for talks in Shanghai, but instead of negotiating, he gave orders for his troops to slaughter every red communist they could find. It was said, heads rolled in ditches like ripe plums. Chiang later hung their heads in baskets as a sinister warning to all communists. Edgar Snow found Mao Zedong in a cave, anxious to tell his little-known story to the world.
Snow, huh?
Edgar Snow。
Mao was at first suspicious of the Western journalist.
我知你行咗好耐嘛。
He explained how after the Shanghai massacre, the communists were splintered and forced into hiding. Mao established himself in the mountains southwest of Shanghai with only 1,000 men. Mao believed victory lay in harnessing the power of the peasants. There he met Chu Tai, a jovial, brilliant soldier who saw in Mao the political mentor he could trust. Mao recognized in Chu a practical military genius who could inspire an army and win battles. They became inseparable. By 1934, their peasant guerrilla army had grown from 1,000 to 200,000 men. Night after night, in between poker games, Mao described to Snow his fight for survival.
一定咧，嗰啲工人啊，一定要知道嘢，學多啲嘢。
How he used guerrilla warfare to resist Chiang's persistent efforts to annihilate the growing pockets of the communist Red Army. Guerrilla tactics proved successful in thwarting Chiang's determination to wipe out any opposition to his nationalist power. The Red Army had the support of their powerful brothers in Russia, but the Russian Communist Party was determined to keep the Chinese Red Army under their thumb. Mao was considered a rebel for his insistence on the peasants' participation in the revolution. He was expelled from the Chinese Communist Central Committee. In 1932, Moscow sent more money and their toughest agent, Otto Braun, a fair-haired German known as a womanizer and a bully, and who did not speak a word of Chinese. Braun immediately took command. He abandoned Mao's guerrilla tactics, insisting instead on a stand-and-fight policy. This played right into the nationalists' hands. In the battles that followed, Chiang slaughtered the Red Army. By October 1934, nationalist forces had succeeded in surrounding the Red Army's base in southern Jiangxi. With more than 1 million men backed up by 400 planes, Chiang was sure of victory. Threatened with certain annihilation, Otto Braun decided the Red Army should run for it. Snow learned of the agony of who had to go and who had to stay. 20,000 wounded were left behind, along with wives, brothers, and children. Mao, out of power, could take his pregnant wife, but had to leave his 2 children behind. Sick with malaria, Mao was transported by litter. Most of those left behind were later rounded up and beheaded by the nationalists. Mao explained, "I was only able to take along my broken umbrella, 2 blankets, and my overcoat. We all took our regular straw shoes." In the dead of night, on October the 16th, 1934, 100,000 men escaped into the darkness. Their move was so unexpected, they were able to pass through the nationalist lines with little fighting. With no plan, their hope was to link up with surviving pockets of the Red Army scattered across China. Some stubborn young boys who refused to be left behind became known as the Little Red Devils. Seldom older than 12, they ran messages and took care of the sick. When Chiang learned that the Red Army had slipped out of his trap, he struck with a vengeance. How could the Red Army survive? In their desperate flight, they abandoned their baggage trains, sewing machines, printing presses, and thousands of documents. They even buried their money along the side of the road. In the next 3 months, the communists lost over 50,000 men. "We were like wild men," Mao told Snow, living and fighting by instinct. "Many of our best commanders were killed or died of disease. We had no medicines, and our ammunition was low." The Red Army struggled westward. In January, by disguising themselves as nationalist forces, they captured the city of Zunyi. Mao, now over his malaria, makes a bid for the leadership. After meeting with the Central Committee, he emerges as the undisputed leader of the Revolutionary Military Council. His first action is to appoint his ally and friend, Chu Tai, Commander-in-Chief. Otto Braun, out of funds and out of communication with Moscow, loses all authority. With Mao and Chu Tai back in charge, the tenor of the Long March changes. Mao directs them north, to a corner of China where his anti-Japanese policy will find him friends. But first, he must cross the heavily guarded Yangtze River. Mao took the initiative. He cunningly lured Chiang's forces away from the expected crossing point and pushed on north. The Great Yangtze is one of many obstacles. In the Long March north, they are to cross 24 rivers and 18 mountain ranges. Mao was a poet as well as a man of action. During the march, his wife gave birth to a son whom she had to leave with the peasant woman. The child was never heard of again. In one of his poems, Mao wrote, "The Red Army fears not the trials of a distant march. For them, 1,000 mountains, 10,000 rivers are nothing. To them, the 5 ridges ripple like little waves, and the mountain peaks of Wu Meng roll by like mud balls." North of the Yangtze, their first obstacle was to cross Lolo Land, a remote area where the tribes passionately hated the Chinese. Mao's men were forced to prostrate themselves and to offer bribes of guns and money. Only by drinking the blood of a freshly slaughtered chicken in a display of brotherhood were they allowed to pass. On their route north, Mao and the Red Army found themselves at the Tatu River. Mao faced an impossible situation. There were only 3 boats to ferry his 45,000 men across, and the nationalists were closing in fast. They were trapped. Mao had to cross that river or it would mean the end of the Red Army. Again, he did the unexpected. To the north, 80 miles away, lay the famous chain-link bridge of Luting. If the Red Army could capture that bridge, they might have a chance. Mao ordered his army to march for their lives. For 72 hours, day and night, north along the river, they marched double time. At night, torches lit up both sides of the river. The torches on the far side, however, belonged to the nationalist troops, hurrying to join the defense forces already stationed at the Luting Bridge. The bridge was made of iron chains with links as thick as rice bowls, spanning 100 yards of river. The nationalists had pulled up half the plank flooring, leaving only exposed chains on the Red Army's side. Mao's men arrived at the bridge just ahead of the nationalist reinforcements. While his troops pinned down the far side, 22 of Mao's bravest soldiers were sent to cross the chain links and capture the bridgehead. Carrying Tommy guns, big knives strapped across their backs, 12 grenades apiece tucked into their belts, 22 heroes climbed across the swaying bridge chains in the teeth of intense enemy fire. The army watched breathlessly. One after the other, men were shot and fell into the torrent below. Men followed close behind, laying down planks so the rest of the army could cross. Just as they reached the flooring near the bridgehead, they saw enemy soldiers dumping cans of kerosene on the planks and setting them on fire. They ran through the flames and threw their hand grenades at the enemy. The enemy retreated to their second line of defense. Within an hour, the Red Army was moving across the bridge and out of reach of the main nationalist forces. But Mao's troubles were far from over. The Red Army had been marching 8 months and covered 4,000 miles. Only 40,000 of the original 100,000 remained, and they were on their last legs. Mao was in a perilous situation. 7 ranges of enormously high mountains stood in his path. The Great Snowy Mountains. Magical mountains, the locals said. Birds could not fly over them, and the best thing any sane man could do was go around. But Mao knew that his only hope was to cross them and avoid the plains. He hoped too that the Red Fourth Front Army would meet them on the other side with support. From the south, with no experience of snow, Mao's army wore only straw sandals and cotton clothes. They were given hot pepper soup to survive. Tung Pi Wu, a survivor, wrote, "We started straight up the mountain, heading for a pass near the summit. Heavy fog swirled about us and there was a high wind. As we climbed higher and higher, we were caught in a terrible hailstorm, and the air became so thin that we could hardly breathe at all. Speech was impossible, and the cold so dreadful that our breath froze and our hands and lips turned blue." Mao, again sick with malaria, had a difficult time with the crossing. At one point, he and his bodyguard practically had to carry one another over the mountain. On the 11th of June, the Red Army finally left the Great Snowies and streamed down into the valley to be met by the scouts of the Red Fourth Front Army.
咁樣先行得到。
But fierce argument quickly followed among the leaders whether the combined forces should go north or west. To stop the destruction of the party, Chu Tai headed west with the Fourth Front Army. Mao determinedly took his men north. Beyond the snowy mountains lay the Red Army's greatest challenge. In late August, after 11 months of marching, Mao and his remaining 30,000 men crossed the notorious grasslands, a trackless, killer swamp. To cross the grasslands was a journey of 7 deadly days. It was an ocean of high grass, covering a morass of thick black muck, and bogs deep enough to swallow a horse. Scouts went ahead to mark the trail. Those who came next had an easy time following. Soon, however, the trail markers disappeared, and men and animals floundered and were lost. One soldier said there was no dry place to camp, no trees. Many were weak and sick when they reached the grasslands. Horses fell in between the tufts, and many, along with the men, became victims of the bogs. The lucky ones were dragged out. When the Red Army finally crossed the grasslands, it numbered less than 7,000. And they still had 500 miles to go, north, often through hostile territory. But Mao knew that he was nearing a safe communist base. The area the Red Army was approaching was just south of China's Great Wall. Here they could rest and gather support to fight the Japanese. On October the 25th, 1935, more than a year after the start of the Long March, Mao's army reached the ancient stronghold town of Baoan, where Mao established his headquarters in one of the cave dwellings. There, in northern Shenxi, he would establish the provincial capital of the Chinese People's Soviet Republic. Only 4,000 of the original 100,000 men were still alive. One year later, Chu Tai would rejoin Mao after the effort to establish a base in the west had failed. Mao's policy to head north had been proved right. Then he requested Snow to take his terms for unification to fight the Japanese to Chiang Kai-shek. Before he left, Mao assured Snow that one day he would rule China, building from a secure base of only 40,000 peasants. It is impossible, Snow wrote in his journal, not to recognize the Long March as one of the great triumphs of men against odds. While the Red Army was unquestionably in forced retreat, its toughened veterans reached their planned objective with moral and political will as strong as ever. Mao's leadership during the Long March established him as the one man capable of controlling this vast and troubled nation. It would be 10 years before his revolution was established, and he turned the horrors and the triumphs of the Long March into legend, and he became a demigod who could do no wrong, and the Chinese people would pay a terrible price. Mao would rule China for nearly 30 years as a destructive tyrant. He would destroy most of his friends of the Long March. He would destroy himself with absolute power. But he would establish for peasants everywhere the belief that they could start and win a revolution. When he died in 1976,